Senior Chinese policymakers meet to map out the nation's economic blueprint for 2021. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. As the global economy continues to feel the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, China is setting out its economic goals for the coming year. Top policymakers wrapped up the annual Central Work Conference on Friday with their sights set on the country's economic recovery. CGTN's Gao Ang has more from Beijing.
A roadmap for economic development. For 2021, China aims to continue promoting technology innovation and building a stronger domestic market, while stabilizing the financial sector. It's all part of what the government calls high-quality development, which is detailed in China's 14th five-year plan. It also aims to enhance the capability of industrial and supply chains to be independent and controllable.
So China will shift more on the keyword, which is controllability, with its own fate, by which we need to focus more on those fundamental technologies that is able to reduce reliance on global supply.
Besides tech innovation, China plans to focus on ensuring food security, achieving carbon neutrality, preventing disorderly expansion of capital, and promoting economic reforms. Also high on the agenda is boosting domestic consumption. Professor Liu explains how this could be achieved.
More job opportunities and more opportunities for entrepreneurship, more business opportunities for the employers because they are there to decide on the salary level. Then also to provide better social security program so that people can be alleviated of the uncertainties, so that they are able to empty their pockets to buy more.
Officials say China is still in an important period of strategic opportunity. They say the country needs to take its chances and speed up economic transformation. China's economy may face more complexities in the coming year brought by COVID-19 and an unstable world. So the government has prepared multiple policies to keep the economy both resilient and robust. Gang, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, there is much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. Sarah Xu is a visiting scholar at Fudan University. She joins us from Knoxville in Tennessee. With us here in Washington is Jeff Moon, former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China and President of China Moon Strategies. And also with us here in Washington is Sourabh Gupta. He is a Senior Asia-Pacific Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Einar Tangen, let me start with you. This meeting took place while the world is grappling with the coronavirus pandemic. One of the things we've seen, most economies being hit by this pandemic, but China stands alone among nations because it will show growth this year. In fact, the IMF predicts 1.9% growth for 2020. How was China able to weather the storm?
Well, quite frankly, it was because of the way they handled the COVID-19, beginning with the outbreak. They put in effect very, very strong measures. They locked everything down, in essence, for 3 months, but that seemed to have done the trick. They became able to handle it. But more importantly, it was not just that they had masks, social distancing, and keeping people isolated and having the treatment things. They took a very broad strategy of testing and tracking. And that has made the biggest difference here. Anytime there is even the smallest outbreak, you see an outpouring of testing and the very sophisticated tracking abilities to make sure that it's done. Now, after that is finished, they have put in place everything that they thought was necessary, but without, raising a panic. They did not jump on just throwing money at the economy. It's been very, very targeted, and you see that trend continuing in this work report.
So, Einar, the Central Economic Work Conference, which just concluded its work, they've set out a number of strategies going ahead. What did you make of them?
Well, I was quite impressed because they're very broad. They have not given up any kind of the social services goals that they had before, poverty alleviation, jobs, access to services. Those are all there. What was most notable, though, is they actually mentioned decoupling and being self-sufficient. And it's clear that they think that technology is going to be the key to this. And there are two ways they can do that. It's not only jobs and creating an economy there, but what technology will bring to the Chinese economy, especially this new digital infrastructure, will be the ability to be much more efficient, to cut down the middleman costs. Also notable was a follow-up on and mention that they're not going to allow kind of predatory practices by these large behemoth organizations who can, seemingly get unlimited amount of money and thereby, in essence, capture markets and then tax consumers as opposed to providing services.
Sarah Xu, one of the priorities for China's leaders is to crack down on what they term tech monopolies. What kind of impact will that have, especially on big corporations, thinking of companies like Alibaba, for instance?
Well, I think it's going to have a really big impact on Alibaba. Already, Alibaba is trying to scale back some of its offerings with Ant Financial, some of its wealth management products. I think, it's really going to make them have to be more competitive, especially with smaller firms. In the work report, it mentioned that the Chinese officials wanted these large companies to be more competitive and render fair competition. So this means that smaller firms would also have a better chance of doing business. There's also the idea that these companies should not have a monopoly over data collection. And that's sort of a new thing that the government hadn't really spoken extensively about before. We knew there were rumors with regard to Alibaba and Ant Financial, but now it seems more solidified. And this is something that can help to protect consumers' rights.
Sarah, this conference also talked a lot about technology, developing technology, innovation. There was a big focus on what the conference termed high-quality development. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that, this is a good thing when the government provides support in terms of finance or just general policy support for science and technology innovations. This can really help to promote some of the major innovations that the country really needs. This will help the rollout of a more digitalization, as well as building up China's own base for different types of technologies that it very badly needs, such as production of semiconductors. And so this will help the Chinese economy to become more resilient to these types of external shocks like COVID, and to help them to have a more stable economy going forward.
Sourabh, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that China will be responsible for more than 1/3 of global economic growth in 2021. In fact, it says China will possibly lead the recovery. What do you make of that assessment?
China was struck with COVID first, it got over COVID first, and it has just been moving forward. And it has been moving forward with a balanced economic model. It's not being pump priming as such. There has been a little bit of pump priming, but they've not gone overboard. And I would actually foresee next year that they will start paring down some of the fiscal support that they have given. Obviously, China is a huge entity, and the most important part out here is that China is making incredibly good progress in signing free trade or preferential trade agreements. We saw the RCEP signed just in November. We've got good news on the comprehensive agreement on investment with the Europeans, and obviously that allows China to be an engine of growth as well as perhaps an importer for many of these countries which are looking for growth motors overseas, since their own growth engines are sputtering to some extent.
Right, Sourabh, China wants to be independent. It wants to lessen its reliance on other countries. How big a challenge is that going to be?
It is going to be a challenge, but I wouldn't say it's a very large challenge. There's a very specific challenge. The specific challenge is with regard to core technologies, particularly those which have been export controlled by the US. The way China is writing its plans is that it wants to have a certain degree of redundancy built in supply chains so that no one party can shut off the tap, as they're finding right now in the case of chips, semiconductors. But China wants to stay integrated because at the end of the day, the more China crowds in the international sector and makes it dependent on the China market, and every time a business thinks of having industrial production, it must have a China strategy. China wants to be in that position, so it doesn't want to neglect the international market, but it wants to create that degree, that spare tire, that redundancy, that supply chains have an alternative supplier if somebody turns the tap off, and that's where I think China is going on this front.
Okay, Jeff Moon, while these policymakers in China have been outlining their plans for the future, there have been developments here in the United States. The Trump administration has blacklisted more Chinese companies, prohibiting trade with them. It includes the chip maker, SMIC, and the drone company, DJI. How will these continued tensions between China and the United States impact China's ability to move ahead with its plans?
Well, I think the Trump administration is in power for one more month, and then we're going to have a different approach going forward. So we can't draw too many conclusions about what's going to happen. These will have an impact on China because the economies are so interlinked and they can't decouple. And so China's priority, for example, to be technologically independent or to focus on technology is a priority that has existed for the entire history of the People's Republic of China. Ever since the first 5-year plan, through the Great Leap Forward, through China's indigenous innovation policies, China has always sought technological independence so that it can be independent and then exclude foreigners from their market. So I think that effort on China's part is going to continue. It's going to be very difficult in the highest of the high-tech technologies like semiconductors. China has tried many times and has put many billions of dollars into the semiconductor sector, and it has not been successful, which means that the two economies need to work together for mutual cooperation and mutual prosperity.
Jeff, looking at the meeting that took place in China from here, what was your overall impression of what was discussed there and those points, these 8 points that they brought up?
The 8 points, I think, are familiar points. These are, as I sort of indicated before, these have historically been themes that China has raised before. Increasing the domestic demand, for example, is something very familiar from the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao years. The difference is the current context. The context that China finds itself is quite different, and some of the priorities are in a little bit different order. It was interesting to me that the two top priorities were first tech independence and then supply chain independence. The tone was very defensive, I thought, much more defensive than it has been in the past, and that was quite interesting. But familiar themes, and we'll see how they play out in the current context, and especially how things change during the Biden administration.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
To know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
The world's currencies are more connected than ever before. The mechanisms that drive the economy are universal. Money moves markets. We explain these trends and show you how the cash in your pocket can have a wide-reaching effect. Because money makes the world go round. Global business.
Welcome Welcome back. We're talking about China's economic strategy. Let's get back to our panel. And Einar Tangen, we were talking a moment ago about these latest restrictions imposed by the United States. China has responded. This is the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Wang Weibin. Let's listen.
If this news is true, it will serve as another example of the U.S. using its state power to suppress Chinese companies. The Chinese side stands firmly against it. The U.S. politicization of economic and trade issues violates the principle of market economy and fair competition it always flaunts, and is against of the international trade rules.
So, Anna, China wants to protect the interests and rights of Chinese businesses, as the Foreign Ministry has told us. How does China do that? What options does China have?
Well, that's the difficult part. Really, the only option they have is to take countermeasures, and this results in a kind of tit-for-tat situation that we've had going on basically through the Trump years. I'm kind of amused to hear people saying, well, it's surprising. Jeff mentioned that China is being so defensive. Well, you know, China's been pummeled by unilateral tariffs, by these sanctions against its companies and things like that. Yeah, if somebody punches you and you draw back, yes, you do look a little bit defensive. But, you know, China's been forced into this situation. This has not been something of China's choice. They've consistently been trying to say, look, let's talk, let's figure this out, but it's been deaf ears. Now, the new Biden administration, unfortunately, the tone might change, but for quite some time, it's not clear that there's going to be any real action. He's going to be looking at his domestic policies, and we'll have to see what happens. But in terms of protecting Chinese companies, a lot of that is going to be dependent on what kind of actions the U.S. takes.
Sarah, as China moves towards independence, technological independence, what effect is that going to have on maintaining supply chains? You know, Jeff pointed out a moment ago that was very high up on that list of priorities.
Yeah, you know, I think that China will help to sort of isolate it or insulate itself to some extent from the West, especially the U.S., due to the actions of the Trump administration. But I don't think that it means that China will isolate itself from the rest of Asia, per se. And China has a really excellent supply chain that is built throughout the rest of Asia. Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, these countries all supply different components to China and play different roles in Chinese products. And so I think that, you know, what this whole supply chain independence means is that China will have some sort of secondary supply chains going forward, not put all of its eggs in one basket. But I think that it may be more willing to increase free trade within Asia, which it already has, you know, signaled to a large extent, and to keep joining various trade pacts. It mentioned that it would potentially join the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that's also another possibility.
Sourabh Gupta, one of China's big strategic goals is to expand consumer demand. In fact, in this document, they talked about the twin goal of expanding demand and improving people's livelihoods. How do you see that unfold?
You know, this has been a focus ever since President Xi's second term began. I remember at the party Congress at that point of time, they talked in terms of a key necessity, and the key necessity was transitioning from high growth to high quality growth. And part of that transition to high quality growth was stimulating domestic demand. One of the areas where they have focused in terms of stimulating domestic demand is actually doing international liberalization of its financial services sector. And part of the reason is that the state-owned banking sector is not very good at intermediating finance beyond the big private and state-owned companies. And the better financial intermediation we have in China, it will reach pockets of the small and medium sector, which is nourished typically by the shadow banking sector, but that itself has been put under wraps to some extent. And this will allow for broader income gains to happen, income gains translating down into wage gains also. We must also remember that the dual circulation policy, which President Xi laid out, is fundamentally also to have domestic demand-driven growth as the key motor, while having, of course, having good supply side growth, but also having the international element integrated within demand side growth. So I think there is a focus. It's going to take a long time. The East Asian model economic model has never been very facilitative of services and consumption-led growth. We've seen the cases in Japan, Korea, not terribly great. But to China's credit, it's moving out early in terms of its national development on this front. And hopefully China will be able to stimulate its domestic demand sector too.
Jeff, you pointed out to us a moment ago that President Trump only has about a month to go in office. But if we look at the new incoming administration under Joe Biden, besides tone and possible use of more diplomatic language, do you expect anything of substance to change?
Oh, I do. I think he has said that he wants to cooperate with China where we can. The obvious example is climate change. And there are other areas where we can cooperate. I think the trade war has taught us, however, that dealing with China on trade is particularly difficult. We learned at the end of the trade war that despite China's promises when it joined the WTO, China does not intend to and will never become a market economy. It will not reform. If there are reformers in China, they either aren't there or they don't have power. And that China is not going to level the playing field voluntarily. So those are things that I think the West has learned, and that's going to cause for difficult negotiations and trade going forward. I think, though, that, as you said, there's going to be a lot less ideology and bluster and rhetoric, and so that we will be able to make some progress. And I hope that if we can get some momentum going forward, maybe we can get a rethink from China on some of these trade issues. Services is something that's particularly interesting, because that's an area where China has recognized for at least a decade that the export-led approach is almost tapped out. It needs to move into another area, and services is for growth, and foreigners can help. And China promised when it joined the WTO to allow foreigners to come in and help with things like financial services. That's finally come to fruition within the past year, probably because China realizes that it needs foreign expertise. It does not have that expertise, and foreigners can bring a lot more to the services sector, and that would actually help remedy the trade deficit quite a bit. So that's an area where I hope that China would welcome foreign participation, and maybe we can make some progress in trade.
Einar, what are your views on what Jeff had to say about China's ability to change, its ability to move to a market economy?
Well, I mean, this comes back to the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. I mean, China entered into the WTO and it had a very coercive set of agreements that they had to acquiesce to. And then, later on, the U.S. says, well, gee whiz, you didn't abide by the spirit of what we intended. Well, China never agreed to that. This issue about its economy, it's had a 40-year success story. So Jeff can talk about all these things about how China really needs the rest of the world, and I agree. It's much better when the world is a lot more open. But this idea that China, is a child and it's in need of a parental, controls and abilities and expertise that it doesn't have, I think is nonsense. China is pioneering a digital economy, which in essence will turn the tables on the rest of the world. 2 years might not seem like a lot, but between 5G, AI, and this digital economy, the digitalization of the yuan, etc., things are going to change dramatically. And I'd be interested to hear what Jeff would have to say in a couple of years when that has happened about who needs who. It's better that everyone works together, but China cannot be alone in its desire to do that. If the U.S. punches China, they have to react.
Jeff, your response very quickly, please.
Well, all that aside, I think Silicon Valley is perfectly prepared to compete with China, and on a level playing field, I think both sides will be making progress. And of course, I'm not saying that China is a child or anything like that. China is the number 2 economy in the world, and will soon be the largest economy in the world. And so all of that bluster is unnecessary.
Sarah, sure, of course, all this is not just about growth and production and expanding the economy. It's also about climate change. That's a very big priority for China. How do all of these economic plans fit in with China's desire to get to carbon neutrality by 2030. I mean, we know it's a country that still depends very heavily on coal, for instance, to drive its economy.
Yeah, so China is trying to promote the coal consumption to peak as soon as possible in order to speed up their adjustment into a carbon CO2 reduced society. And one of the technologies that they are exploring is improvement of new energy technologies. They already have developed a lot of wind energy, hydropower energy, solar energy, and it has some of the most windmills in the world and dams and so on. But it does recognize that it needs to do more. And so it's trying to really rapidly construct a carbon emission trading market and improve energy consumption. It's already more energy efficient, but it's trying to improve energy consumption just to boost the energy structure as well. And so I think that they will provide technologies to really help this process.
Sourabh, China's economy, as we said earlier on, is going to show growth this year for 2020, 1.9% according to the IMF. But what about foreign demand in the months ahead, in the years ahead for that matter? How is that going to impact China's plans?
Foreign demand is not going to be as important for China. It has already, frankly, become a lesser factor for China's growth. It's already more domestic demand generated. But where I think China sees foreign demand is having high quality interactions with the key advanced economies in a number of technology-intensive areas. That's one of the reasons I've been very disappointed with many of these export controls which have been imposed. It's not about imposing export controls. I mean, you can threaten export controls, but you need to threaten that with the goal of hoping to shift China to a level playing field in terms of industrial subsidies and pro-market practices, which is the direction China is going. And frankly, with the investment negotiations almost reaching the point of success with the Europeans, that's where China has gone. So I would have wished that those export controls were conditioned on China's pro-market policies, which is frankly where it's headed towards. But the sense I get is those right. Export controls are intended more to squelch competition from China and to squeeze it at this point of its development itself. We'll see where this goes, and so okay. we'll have to know that. But the important thing is China wants to be technologically integrated with the world, right. Foreign demand irrespective.
Okay, we have to go, unfortunately. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.